Okay. Good afternoon. Ni hao. So I usually do morning meetings. Breaking the rules today. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is a China Environment Forum meeting. For those of you new, there are a few new folks in the audience who are unfamiliar perhaps with the Wilson Center. I always like telling you that we were created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to our 28th president, who was both a policy and a scholar. And in his spirit, we endeavored to bring both the scholarly and policy communities together around various foreign policy issues. There are about 13 projects and programs, as well as a fellowship program here as well. The China Environment Forum, we're in our 10th year anniversary. I should have brought cake, because I actually think it was started around this time of year, September 10 years ago, you guys. Yay. And for 10 years, we've been bringing together government, NGO, business, and researchers around environmental and energy issues in China. Now, today's meeting is about regulating food safety in China. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm an ambulance chaser, because it's been in the news a lot lately, because the China Environment Forum for many years has been looking at issues of food safety and food security problems in China linked to pollution, usually water pollution, pesticide residues. And so I really feel that this is very much a natural extension of our work. A lot of the drivers within China, the governance issues, are very similar and often overlapped with the same issues we look at in the environmental policy sector. So I'm very excited that today marks the beginning of, there'll be a series of meetings, beginning with this one in the fall, possibly some in the spring, and also a publication that's going to be looking at kind of U.S.-China food safety partnership possibilities. Because many of you who have been in my China Environment Forum Mafia for years know that at the Wilson Center we promote dialogue, and the China Environment Forum in particular is trying to really bring the community together, both U.S., China, and around the world, Europe, to look at these issues and think constructively about them. Today, got three wonderful speakers. Just met one today. Michael, we finally got to meet face to face. It's always nice to get someone off the email and into your three-dimensional space. And what we're going to do is we're going to start off with kind of going broad to narrow and in between here. We're going to start off with Paul Young, who's from Waters Corporation. And you do have his bio. I mean, he has a very extensive background, 25 years working on food safety issues in Ireland and for the EU. Someone who's not only worked on the side of the legislation and implementing within Europe, but also doing trainings and outreach in developing countries with the Food and Agriculture Organization and the Food Veterinary Office in Europe. So he's got a lot of really hands-on experience, and he's going to be talking more about kind of like the global issue of food safety with an eye looking at the EU and Japan as they regulate food safety vis-a-vis China. But as he and I have talked quite a lot, outside here, is that it's not just China that has these kinds of problems. And next we're going to have Michael Taylor, who is right now at George Washington University School of Public Health and Health Services. Just moved over there, right? Probably has not even unpacked his boxes. And we were still able to pull him over here in the midst of this move. Has, as you see from the bio, an extensive background both within the government and without, looking at food safety. I mean, he was at USDA's, the administrator of USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service in the mid-1990s, a deputy commissioner of policy at the FDA in the early 1990s. So wealth of knowledge here, and as you could probably imagine from his background, that he'll be talking about some of the challenges that we have in the U.S. in terms of regulating imports. I mean, I think you're going to give it an eye towards China, but it's global, this issue. And last but never least, closest to me here is Drew Thompson, someone who's been in my mafia for quite a while, with different hats on. He's now at the Nixon Center. Prior to that, he was in China, hanging out in Sichuan, working with Merck on HIV/AIDS programs there. CSIS before that. And what I was intrigued though when I got his bio, which I didn't know, he used to run a snack food company in China. So he knows it from deep down in China. He's going to talk about the issue of the challenges within China on regulating. I think we've gotten a lot in the newspapers over the last few months, since particularly since the dog food scandal. But I think that there's more. It's more complex than you might think. But also keep in mind that I think that I know that Paul and Drew will also point out that there are definitely some positive trends in China and globally as well on this. So don't be negative, okay? And right, be negative. Don't be negative. And I'd like to first invite Paul to start us off here. They will each talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A. Okay, and we are webcast today, so when we do the Q&A, we've got two folks who will be handing out microphones. Okay, thank you very much for coming. And Paul.
Thanks very much, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is actually a new experience for me. I give talks all the time, but this is my first webcast. So it's great. In fact, when I mentioned to my wife that this was going to be webcast, she said, make sure they get your good side. And then she took a second look and said, good luck. So maybe I don't have a good side. Yes, as Jennifer said, I come from Ireland, the north of Ireland, so I come from the UK. I was a UK government scientist for more than 25 years, involved mostly in food safety analysis. So my focus here today really is I'm going to discuss how the EU and more laterally how Japan has gone about addressing these kind of food safety issues, both domestically and in imported produce. So I'm just going to give you some practical examples. I'm going to highlight a little of the legislation, and we'll kind of talk around those issues. As I said, for 25 years or more, I was a food safety analyst working for the UK government. And during that time, I found myself increasingly working with Waters Corporation, because Waters really are at the forefront of food safety analysis, and we use their instrumentation a lot. It's probably, the name is almost synonymous with food safety analysis. So I found myself working with them a lot, and eventually this year I was persuaded that I should come and work for them. So that's why I'm here talking to you today, to act as an information resource to pass on some of the information to you.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask.
Okay. Just in case someone falls asleep or you get up and leave, I thought I'd actually cover my conclusions at the very start of this talk. You never know what's going to happen. And these are the conclusions, and we'll kind of lead you into it. But really, I think the main points of this talk are that there is a lot of interest in food safety at the moment. It's got a very, very high profile. Food safety issues focus very prominently in media. And in the consumer's mind. And I think that's also reflected in the fact that organic produce can command a much higher price than other produce, because the consumer perceives that it is safe and they're prepared to pay a little bit extra for that safe product. But one of the main things that I hope that will come out of my talk today is that food safety analysis is not just about protecting the consumer. Of course, that's very, very important. But the truth is, I suppose, that many of us use the word consumer the same way we use the word old. It refers to someone else. But in truth, we are all consumers. But it's not just about protecting consumer, because it's also about protecting our very important agricultural export markets to those economies that rely heavily. I come from Northern Ireland, which is something like 80% of the agricultural produce from Northern Ireland is exported, and the entire economy is based on agricultural exports, essentially. So it's very important, and we've been very focused on ensuring that we can maintain the integrity of our export markets. So it serves those two purposes. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the food safety programs are structured within the EU and within Europe. Within the EU and within Japan, and really I'm going to focus on the way that both of those groups of countries go about handling it. And 2 points really. First of all, if we just rely on assurances from a third country, from an exporting country, to say we promise you that our product is safe, well, that can be risky, because we don't then have the guarantees. We don't have the verification that the programs really are safe. So, in addition to that, there needs to be some level of import testing. And what I'm going to contrast is the way the EU handles it with Japan, just to show that import testing on its own is more reactive than proactive, and it's also extremely expensive. And I think really that the bottom line from my whole message is that to develop an effective food safety program requires collaboration. It will not happen on its own. It certainly doesn't happen through gentlemen's agreements. There must be some kind of legislative basis there to enforce food safety. So there needs to be collaboration between governments that are importing and exporting produce, and within each of the countries there needs to be collaboration between the government involved, between the food industry involved in implementing the regulations, and also between technology leaders such as ourselves at Waters. It's also very important that we also keep a very close eye on what's required by the food industry, so that we can be sure that the technological innovations that we're coming up with are specifically tailored to their needs. So I'll cover these very briefly, but here we've got, I'm in the US, so I'm going to talk about US demands, but really this is a global issue. And on this slide you can see we're highlighting this is some USDA predicted figures for the increase in consumption of food produce. And you can see that even for things like beef and pork there's expected to be a greater than 10% increase in the consumption, the demand for beef and pork in the US between 2000 and 2020. But when we look at horticultural products, the expected increase is significantly more and approaching 20% for many of these commodities. So many countries are actively pursuing increasing their exports, and that largely has been reflected in the decline in the trade balance with the US. The US traditionally has had a very strong trade balance. Back in 1996, I believe the figure was something like a $27 billion surplus. And as you can see, that's declined significantly, and even over the few years that are shown on this slide, it's declined quite a lot. We're down to less than $5 billion of a surplus more recently. Now, that's not a doom and gloom picture, because the USDA report that they expect to see this turnaround, and they expect to see that gap starting to widen again. But the only way that the US will be able to do that is if they focus very heavily on these emerging markets, China and Mexico. And already, this was quite surprising to me, already China and Mexico between them currently account for 25% of the US agricultural exports. That's quite a significant amount. So there's an increasing world demand, and countries all over the world also have it built into their mission statements, their goals, that they will increase production. Along with the increased production, of course, comes increased exports. And the data that I've shown here, since we're discussing China, these are some data from the farm outputs in China. It's not a linear scale here, I'll point out. This starts at 1978 and finishes in 2004. But you can see that over the last few years, there's been a very significant increase in farm outputs. And the reason I've picked these particular commodities, you can see that in particular, there's been a focus on horticultural products because, of course, going along with the USDA data, there is expected to be a much more significant growth in horticultural demand over the next few years. So we have a global food market. Food is traveling all around the world, and what are people's concerns? Well, I think perhaps 50 years ago, if you were to ask people what their concerns were regarding food, they would have told you that price was probably the most important factor. They were most concerned with price. And the data on this slide is the results of a survey carried out in Japan in 2002. And quite surprisingly, 70% of those people that were polled said that the safety of food was of the most important. It was of the overriding importance. And in fact, only 8% of people that were questioned said that price was the most important. So clearly people do consider that safety is more important than price. And what are the kind of things, what are food safety issues? Well, there's quite a lot of them. The data on this slide was taken from an EU poll, and there are quite a lot of things that people in the EU seem to be concerned about. You might say that people in the EU are much too concerned about their food, they worry about everything, but there are a lot of things that are involved here, and many of the things like viruses and bacteria, of course, is what you might expect. But the two that might be a little surprising to some people are the inclusion of pesticide residues and antibiotics and hormone residues in meat. Consumers are becoming very savvy. They're becoming very aware of the issues. And these are the two that just nudge ahead of the rest. And the funny thing about this to me is that these are probably the two that are most easily controlled, because we can put in place good regulations and control them. It's much more difficult to control bacterial contamination or viruses perhaps, but pesticides and vet drug residues should be easily fixed. So I'm going to talk about EU legislation, but before I get into that, we'll just talk about general World Trade Organization agreements. And there are three that I've highlighted here, and I've taken the important bits in red and highlighted them on the screen. So if we first focus on the GATT agreement on tariffs and trade, this agreement specifically allows governments to act on trade in order to protect human health. So that's the first thing. So we don't just have to accept these imports. We are allowed to monitor them and reject them on the basis of a health problem. Then we have the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures Agreement, the SPS agreement. And this tells us that the regulations must be based on science. This is very important, a very key point. They must be based on science. However, there is provision for the use of the precautionary principle. In other words, when there is a risk, we know there is a risk, but we have not very accurately defined what the risk is, governments are permitted to take precautions. Having said all of that, governments are not permitted to use food safety as a technical barrier to trade. And in fact, the World Trade Organization, in conjunction with the Codex Alimentarius, for example, encourages countries to recognize each other's procedures for assessing whether a product conforms or not. So essentially, if you look at the Codex Alimentarius, you'll see that what they recommend is that there should be harmonization of standards. It's a wonderful goal. Unfortunately, we don't have anything like it. We're not even close to having harmonization. But like I said, it would be a worthwhile goal. So since we don't have harmonization, each country, or each, in this case it's the EU, group of countries are able to establish their own food safety legislation and food safety procedures. Now, on the next series of slides, I've got lots of bits of text in black here. I don't want you to focus too much. What I've done is I've included these only for the purposes of reference. It's just to let you see, as I mentioned earlier, food safety doesn't happen through gentlemen's agreements. There must be a legal basis for the enforcement of food safety. So I've included the black bits in screenshots, but what I have done is in my text in blue, I have taken what I think are the key points that are most worthwhile for this talk. So for this piece of legislation, which is overarching for food safety in Europe, it did a number of things. It established this independent European Food Safety Authority, which is an independent point of reference for risk analysis. So as I said, going back to the World Trade Agreement figures, they said that the regulations should be based on science, and that's the role of the European Food Safety Authority, to carry out the risk analysis and ensure, therefore, that there is a scientific basis for the law. Additionally, it established this rapid alert system for food and feed, the RASFF system that we always talk about. And this is a system whereby imported produce is monitored coming into the EU, and when there are violations occur, they're reported through this rapid alert system, so that all of the member states are sharing information, and it highlights the need then for further vigilance on certain products or certain countries. And it also introduces or reinforces perhaps the requirement for traceability at all stages of production. Now, we're talking about China, and I think you'll probably hear some more from Drew in his talk about some of the difficulties associated with enforcing traceability in China. But it's written into EU legislation that there is a requirement for it. The way that the EU approaches it, it starts with its own domestic produce. So the EU says that here are a bunch of criteria that we will apply to our own domestic produce, and then we'll think about imported produce. So we'll start with the domestic produce. The first thing we have to do is define what are the safe levels, and that can be done through the European Food Safety Authority carrying out their risk analysis and the establishment of these maximum residue limits. Here in the US, I believe they may be called tolerances, but essentially these are levels that have been established to be safe, and they're permitted levels. However, there are certain substances where the risk has not been so well defined. They may be hazardous at any concentration, but essentially what it really means is that we haven't established what the safe level is. And what the EU does there is they establish the precautionary principle. And they say, we don't know what the risk is, therefore we do not permit these substances to be present in domestic produce. Additionally, this next piece of legislation defines the sampling and testing frequencies. Within the EU, there are fairly high levels of sampling and testing that's carried out, and it's all fairly well defined. The example that I've highlighted here is that 0.4% of all cattle slaughtered in the EU must be tested for the presence of veterinary drugs and other chemical contaminants. So that's out of every 250 bovines that are slaughtered, at least one must be tested for the presence of contaminants. That's all very well. However, how can we be sure that the methods, the analytical techniques that we're using are fit for purpose, that they're suitable, that they're capable of detecting these hazardous substances at the appropriate concentrations? Well, unlike some other countries, the EU does not prescribe analytical techniques. They do not lay down a set of procedures and say everyone must follow this technique. What they do instead is they have laid down a set of guidelines that must be followed for the validation of those methods to demonstrate that the method is fit for purpose. So, and the methods, the validation must demonstrate that they're capable of detecting the drugs or the pesticides or whatever the compound of interest is, at the appropriate level of interest, which is it's very important. That document also lays down very strict criteria for the confirmation of the presence of those substances. And when you think about it, the criteria are such that we can be absolutely certain that the drug that we claim is present or the pesticide that we claim is present truly is present. And when I first started to think about that, I thought, well, that doesn't really protect the consumer any better than if we just use a screening test. And the truth is that it doesn't. But there's an onus, of course, on the government also to protect the producers, to protect the industry from the risk of false positives. So it's a very important side product of this piece of legislation that when we we develop our analytical techniques, that we're absolutely certain that that when we claim to have confirmed the presence of one of these substances, that we have truly unequivocally done so. And that's what this legislation provides. It's a protection for the producer. So that's how the EU goes about controlling its own domestic production, and how it can ensure that the food produced within the EU is indeed safe for the consumers. But the EU, of course, has no ability to enforce this legislation on any third government. What it does instead is it maintains these approved lists. So it will draw up a list of countries and commodities and even establishments within countries. And for an establishment to be able to export a given commodity, be it shellfish or poultry, to the EU, they must be maintained on this list. And the country also must be maintained on a country list. If they're not, then they do not have the right to export product to the EU. For them to remain on these approved lists, however, that it's subject to a number of things. Number one, it's subject to approval of their own control programs. So these third countries must submit the lists of their programs and how they go about ensuring the safety of the product in their markets or the product that's likely to be exported to the EU. And the EU will go through those and will approve them. In addition, to verify that, then the EU will send out the Food and Veterinary Office, the inspectors from the Food and Veterinary Office of DG Health. And they will go to these countries on a regular basis. They will inspect the competent authorities, the people with responsibility. They will inspect the legislation, and they will even inspect the establishments themselves and the traceability within the whole production system. So, since we're here talking about China, it seems only fair that I put some data up on China. These inspections are carried out also in EU member states and third countries. And what I have on screen here is a screenshot from a fairly recent report in 2006 of a mission, an inspection mission that was carried out in China in March. And these documents they're freely available. They're in the public domain, so you can go onto the EU website and you can read them. And they make a list of recommendations, a list of their findings, and then they finish off with recommendations. And I've highlighted a couple just of the recommendations from this report. And they said that the Chinese authorities should improve the design of their NRCP's National Residues Control Program. So they looked at the control program, they found some deficiencies in it, and they made recommendations as to how that should be changed. And at the next inspection, the very first thing they will do is they will check to see if those deficiencies have been addressed. In addition, it would appear that they identified some problem with the analytical techniques that were being employed. So they've said that the competent authority, the Chinese government, if you like, should ensure that the development and validation of analytical techniques which are capable of meeting EU community requirements. So what they're saying is those methods must be up to our standards. So they also, in addition, they carry out this verification. They carry out inspections and they carry out import testing. And the results of that import testing is published through the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. These reports are published on a weekly basis, and again, they're published on the internet. They're available to view and download. And I've highlighted just a small excerpt from 1 week. Typically, there may be 40 or 50 of these entries. But here we have the country that made the notification, and they found some aflatoxins, which are mycotoxins that grow in peanuts and grain, found in produce from China. But this covers everyone. It's right across the range, and it will cover third countries, and even it will cover product from inside the EU. I mean, you can see here then that we have also aflatoxins coming from the US. There are a couple of entries there. and here we have some veterinary drugs from China and so on. So there are a number of these, and it means that the EU member states can keep an eye on this, they can watch it, and on a regular basis then they can revise their own procedures, and they know that they must target these particular commodities as they come in from particular countries. On an annual basis, they take all of this data and break it down and produce it in a statistical format. And this is a small excerpt from it's a fairly large report, but it highlights all of these alerts, these notifications that are coming out. And you can see, of course, China's number one at the top of the list. However, it's worth focusing that the US is number 4, and if you go to number 5, it's Germany, an EU member state. So no one really is safe from this. Everyone gets tested, and it's worth bearing in mind that whether a country's at the top of a list or further down this it's related to a number of factors, and that could include, for example, how frequently they're being tested, or more importantly, how much produce they're actually exporting. So that there are a number of factors. If you export more and you're being tested frequently, it's inevitable that more violations will be found. But what happens as a consequence of these violations? Well, it can be a number of things, and again, I've put screenshots of these. I know you won't be able to read them, but I put them on just to highlight that this is all legislation-driven. There is a legal basis for all of this. In the first instance, both of these come from 2002. In the first instance, we have increased testing frequency, and this was imposed on Thai aquaculture and poultry products back in 2002 when some of the nitrofuran antibiotics were detected in their product. So in that case, the 100% of the imports were held at the first port of entry into the EU until the consignments were tested for the presence of these substances. If it's deemed that it's much more severe than that, then there can also be a prohibition on import. And this is what happened with China back in 2002. And there was essentially a ban placed on importing aquaculture products from China. So the consequences of these violations can be very serious. Now, you're going to hear from Mike about, I think, about the US system and the way that it's implemented. And really, and to a large part, it's not that dissimilar to the way the EU regulations run. Much of the rules that I've previously talked about have been in place for quite some time, and it refers to food of animal origin. However, back in 2002, this legislation was introduced, and it extends most of those rules to cover all food being imported into the EU and indeed produced within the EU. So it's significantly broadened the scope. So now we're looking at food of animal origin and of non-animal origin, so all foods. And it's worth noting, if you want to have a look at this piece of legislation, that there's also a section on cost recovery, because food safety testing doesn't come cheap. Someone has to pay for it. And the way the EU has decided to do that is by making the food business operator responsible for the costs. And this legislation lays down some rules and guidelines with regard to recouping the costs of the control programs. Japan. Again, the legislation in Japan is structured very similarly. On the face of it, it looks very similar to the EU legislation, but in practice there are some subtle, and in some cases not so subtle, differences. Japan was probably a bit lax. Up until 2002, the regulations were not very strict. But Japan is one of the least self-sufficient food countries in the world, and they import more than 60% of all of the food. Back in 2002, the consumer organizations there identified that there were some problems with chemical contaminants, and they decided there wasn't an effective program to monitor them. So, as a result of this finding of this high level of contamination in imported food, the Japanese modified their legislation. They modified the food safety basic law to do, well, a number of things, but among them was this establishment of this Food Safety Commission. So it's very similar to the European Food Safety Authority. It's an organisation that has responsibility for risk analysis to ensure that there is a legal basis for the food law. In addition, they modified their standards. And this document is frequently referred to as the Japanese positive list. And essentially what the Japanese did was they compiled a list of 799 substances, and they've established tolerances for all of those substances in all of the different food groups. There are some substances, just like the EU, where tolerances have not been identified, and for those, again, they adopt the precautionary principle and they say these substances should not be detected in any food group. So on the face of it, it's largely similar to the EU, but there are some differences. So the differences are these. In Japan, the onus for compliance is placed on the importer. So the importer is responsible for ensuring that food imported into Japan is compliant with all of the local legislation. Japan does not demand equivalence with local legislation as the EU does. It's quite different in Japan. In Japan, they do not test for all of the substances that are on the Japanese positive list in their domestic produce, because they say, well, we have our own rules and regulations and we can control domestic production, but we cannot control production in a third country. So the range of chemicals and substances that are being tested for are actually quite different for domestic produce and that's imported. And the way that Japan controls this and ensures that there's compliance is by carrying out a very high level of import testing. It's extremely high. You know, I've seen figures quoted for the US where the FDA inspects examine about 1%, and I think it was 0.2% that undergoes laboratory inspection. In Japan, laboratory tests are carried out on more than 10% of imported produce. One way that Japan differs very significantly from the EU is that they prescribe analytical methods for use in Japanese control labs. Now, they don't enforce these methods to be used outside of Japan, but all of the labs carrying out testing inside Japan for control must use these prescribed methods. And that's a big difference because, as I said to you before, the EU, they just set a set of procedures that must be followed for validation of methods. The big difference there is that allows the EU to adopt new technologies as they come along. And it's one of the reasons why Waters Corporation is so involved in food safety analysis, because Waters as a company has been focused on developing these new technologies that allow people involved in food safety analysis to analyse more and more samples in a shorter period of time, and also to look at a much broader range of analysis to ensure that we've got a broad enough scope that the food truly is safe. In Japan, they've run into the difficulty here by prescribing methods as these new technologies have come along that they don't fit in with the prescribed methods. So in some ways they've limited themselves. And I was in Japan there just a couple of weeks ago discussing with some of the food safety analysts there, and they admitted to me that this is a problem and it's limiting their ability to extend the scope of their multi-residue analytical methods, and they would like to see this changed. Japan also publishes lists of violations. They publish them on a quarterly basis, and here you can see some examples of some produce and the reasons why they've been rejected. And there's a number of things that they do. They say that imports must be subjected to voluntary tests at first import. Now, that must and voluntary doesn't sound like the two words that go together to me, but that's what they do. They enforce the importers to carry out tests which the importers have to pay for themselves the first time that they import the produce. When violations occur, then the level of testing of that produce will be increased, so it may be much higher than 10% for certain commodities. And it states in their legislation that if they see a repeat violation occurring more than 5% of those samples that are tested, then they will institute, or they may institute, a complete ban on the importation of that product or from that country. In practice, what this means is that since the onus is placed on the importers, that the importers will demand test certificates from the exporting companies. So much of the testing that is carried out for the Japanese positive list is actually carried on outside Japan. So I think I might be just on time. But in conclusions, I just cover these again. Consumers are certainly focused on food safety. It's very high profile. It's in all of the media. And consumers seem to be prepared to pay a little bit extra for safer food. What I tried to show you today was that regulatory food safety analysis is not just about protecting consumers. It's also about protecting commerce. And it's which one of those you deem is more important depends on which hat you're wearing or where you sit. Any effective program, if it's going to be effective, it must be comprehensive. And just to rely on assurances given from a third country is too risky. relying on just testing of imports, as we've seen with Japan, is going to be very expensive. And I think really that we probably have to get some kind of balance somewhere in between, where we have collaboration between governments to get those assurances that the food is being produced in a safe fashion, and also some level of testing to verify those procedures. But additionally, I think within any country, a food safety program will only be effective if there is an additional level of collaboration. Collaboration carried out between the government of the country, between the food producing industry to ensure that all of the regulations and rules are being followed, and indeed between technology leaders such as Waters Corporation, so that we can all work together to make sure that we're meeting the demands of those importers, we're meeting the demands of the export markets, and that the food safety programs are effective and are doing the job that they're intended to do. So with that, I'll thank you for all of your time, and I'm sorry for going over.
It's okay.
But
we'll
thanks a lot
later.
for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Now they're going to do a minuet and switch. And actually what came to mind, you're going to let Paul, I think you need to add to at the end of your presentation, a Confucian phrase of zhongyong zhi dao, finding the golden middle path of regulating. You know, that in many ways, I mean, the U.S. maybe not, in some minds, not being stringent enough. We're going to learn more in a moment about some of the challenges. But we have seen that some of us, and we'll talk about more in the Q&A, about how Japan and EU, they have been very big at pushing China in you know, not only through the bans, but also through outreach and training to them on strengthening their food export safety. So, yeah, zhongyong zhi dao. I'll teach you that one later. So now we're going to learn about some of the U.S., about, you know, where we're going, the path forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everybody. I guess it's a sign of the times that a person whose background is in U.S. food safety regulation is invited to speak at a meeting of the China Environment Forum. But I think it is indicative of where we are on food safety. You really can't separate what's going on food safety in the United States or any of the major trading countries from what's going on in China or anywhere else around the world. I think those of us who have been working on food safety reform in the United States for a long time have actually a bit of debt of gratitude to the situation in China. I mean, it's not that China put the subject of food safety reform in the United States on the radar screen for the first time. It's been there for a long time. We've just recently had our own issues with domestically grown produce, outbreaks of illness associated with fresh produce in this country. But I do think that the events surrounding pet food, oddly enough, you know, may be the ones that get us to the tipping point here in terms of the politics of food safety reform in the United States. I think there's a real shift in recognition that the time has come to look hard at some of the fundamentals of the way we do food safety in this country, and it's going to affect the way in which we work with trading partners. There's just no question about it. There are ideas on the table that I think really will transform the way in which we oversee imports, which will necessarily transform the way we oversee domestic product. We can't impose on imports, obviously, a level of control and a set of regulatory measures that we don't also impose domestically. So it is all tied together. What I want to do is just take a few minutes to sort of survey the lay of the land, sort of current state of play in the United States and how we oversee imports. And then I want to say some things about what's wrong with the way we oversee imports, and then talk about some of those ideas that are out there that I think are going to move in a very different and I think very positive direction to improve the way we oversee imports from a public health standpoint, which is basically where I come from, but also critically important. If we don't have a good, solid way to assure safety of product, we really do jeopardize trade. And I think, you know, clearly the way in which we look to reform food safety oversight has to take trade concerns into account. And so that, I think, very fair game for discussion. I think most of the facts about you know, why we have a big import challenge here in the United States are pretty, you know, well known to people. The volume of imports has grown enormously. I mean, there are elements of our food supply like seafood where a large majority of the seafood consumed in this country is imported. It's 75% is one estimate that I've seen. But we all know, you know, the pattern of relying on imported fresh produce during certain times of the year. I think the China situation has highlighted the fact that there's rapid change in the international marketplace for food, and in particular food ingredients, with certain food ingredients now the supply in the United States really being dominated by imports, including from China. We have seen the reality that there are weak controls in some countries, and I think we're seeing some light shed on China now, but it's obviously not just a Chinese problem. I mean, if you look all around the world, there's a wide diversity of practices in food safety oversight. It's also the case that there are many places around the world where there are enormously good oversight regimes. And you also see situations, particularly in developing countries, where there'll be a dual system, sort of a domestic consumption level of oversight, which may be very low or non-existent, and then a level of government oversight of exports that's intended to meet the importing country standards that can be very high. And I've been in seafood export plants in Uganda, for example, that are exporting to Europe, and they are the most pristine, well-run seafood processing plants you'll see anywhere in the world. So it's a kind of a complex picture out there. But the issue of not having controls in exporting countries that meet U.S. standards is part of the picture. But what I really want to focus on is sort of the problem with what we do, here in the U.S. and our public oversight system. And part of the reason why we have such a big challenge today is that FDA is really operating under an approach to oversight that is way pre-globalization. The authority that FDA relies upon to oversee imported foods was enacted in 1938, and it basically just says that FDA has the authority to detain imported products if it appears adulterated, which means that FDA has some reason to believe that one of the safety-related standards in the food law in this country has not been met. And if it can make a showing to that effect, then it can detain the import at port of entry. But there's no authority to work upstream, to work preventively, to make access, for example, for inspection purposes to foreign plants a condition of import into this country. And so there's a very weak sort of statutory framework, and then compounded by the very thin resources at FDA. This has been a kind of a visible issue in this country for a while, the eroding resources at FDA, particularly on the food side of FDA. And that's a problem that's increasingly getting a lot of attention. But this has resulted in a loss of confidence, really. And I think this is really what's changing the dynamics politically. I think the food industry realizes that there's a credibility problem with U.S. oversight of the food supply generally and imports in particular right now. That's what's visible right now. And I think we all realize that for public health reasons and for economic reasons, we've got to work to fix the system. Just a little bit more about the FDA oversight model. I think you've heard a little bit about it already, but as I indicated, it is based primarily on this port of entry inspection regime, which is about detecting problems if FDA can detect the problem. It's very hard to detect when you only inspect 1% of the shipments and test a fraction of that, as Paul indicated. FDA does its best with what it has, and so it does make efforts to target its limited inspection resources at the port of entry to countries or commodities that it has a basis to believe are problematic, that are at higher risk of contamination or violating U.S. standards. But its ability to do that with the resources it's got is really very limited, and again, it has no authority to go out to those foreign plants. And the way I really want to focus the thinking here about what's wrong with the current system and what needs to be achieved is that FDA has no mandate for prevention of problems. Its mandate is to detect problems if it can and correct them after the fact. It's a fundamentally reactive system, though, as opposed to a preventive system. And I think if we learn one thing in food safety, you're not going to get where you want to go unless you have a preventive system. It's interesting that people, I think, who don't pay attention to food safety for a living may not be as mired in this reality as some of the rest of us are, but having worked at both FDA and USDA, I'm terribly mired in the reality that we have two fundamentally different regulatory approaches to food safety in the United States. We have two agencies and two different statutory regimes and traditions about food safety regulation and oversight. And there's a fundamentally different approach at USDA in its oversight of meat and poultry imports than we have at FDA. Again, USDA regulates meat and poultry and products that contain 2% or more of meat or poultry ingredients. FDA regulates everything else. For meat and poultry products, we have this century-old concept in place and statutorily mandated that USDA inspect every carcass going through every slaughter plant and visit every meat and poultry processing plant every day. And the USDA has a budget of about $1 billion to do that. They've got 7,500 inspectors whose job it is to go and meet that statutory mandate for inspection. A lot of us think it's an outmoded mandate. It's not risk-based. There's a lot of deficiencies in it. But it's that mandate that underlies the mode of import inspection. And because what they basically do with their import inspection regime is ensure that the exporting country has in place the same level of inspection and the same standards in place that USDA has. So it's similar to what Paul described in the EU context, where before a country can export meat and poultry products to the United States, the U.S. Has to audit the inspection system of the exporting country government to be sure it's equivalent to the U.S. system, including the standards that are in place. It has to approve the plants, similar to the EU model for animal products, based on actual USDA inspector audits and visits to these plants, and they periodically revisit these plants. And then in addition to that, there's a port of entry inspection by USDA inspectors. So there's a multi-tier system, which is preventive with respect to the possibility of violations of U.S. standards. And so there's two different models at work here right now in the United States, but we actually have a third model, which applies to seafood. And again, we're back in FDA's jurisdiction. FDA has regulatory jurisdiction over the safety of seafood, and in the early 90s, it introduced and mandated for the first time a framework for preventive process control for food safety called HACCP. And again, all the food safety folks know what I mean. It's an acronym for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. It's basically an approach that, in a way, common sense to being preventive about food safety problems. It involves knowing what the hazards are, identifying the points in the system where the hazard can be prevented or reduced, putting in place controls, monitoring that, verifying that the controls are working, and having plans for dealing with problems when they do arise. It's sort of the modern approach to preventive process control for food safety, which FDA has mandated for seafood. USDA has also mandated it for meat and poultry. Key element of that regulation, though, because of the huge volume of imports coming in, is that for the first time, FDA defined a responsibility of the importer to assure in some prospective way that the product coming in from overseas that importer is bringing in has been produced under the same HACCP standards and procedures that FDA has mandated for domestic product. And this principle of importer accountability is one that I think you'll see in a minute, I think is emerging as a pretty critical idea that has to be applied more broadly here in this country. The strength of this HACCP approach or the seafood model at FDA is that it is based on the principle of prevention. The downside is that it's been implemented, I think, less than successfully. I think because of lack of resources to do adequate inspections and looking, behind the assurances that importers provide, the lack of clear legal authority to go inspect plants and create some real accountability upstream. The seafood HACCP model, I think, is good in concept, but has been a little bit weak in implementation. So where do we go from here? With those as the models that are in place here, what do we see as potential elements of the solution? And I've got just four here that I think are kind of important to keep our eye on. And the first is this idea of private sector management of the supply chain. That there is no way that government inspection or government regulation will make food safe. The government has a role, which I'll talk about in a minute, for imposing accountability for the private sector to produce and market food that is safe in accordance with publicly set safety standards. So in the import context, we've got to rely on the expertise and the capacity and all the business incentives that companies have to manage their supply chain well for food safety. We do have to focus on improving oversight and controls in exporting countries. I think, as Paul indicated, we're going to get a handle on imports by harnessing both what the private sector and the public sector can do, and the exporting countries certainly in their regulatory systems have a role to play. The issue of international standard setting, I think, is one that also, again, has been around for a long time. There's been a lot of work through the United Nations Codex Alimentarius Commission to establish standards that can be adopted by countries and be the basis for harmonized standards internationally. I think a lot more effort needs to go into making that process work expeditiously and be able to be a more effective source of international standards. And then finally, obviously we've got to really step up what we do in the United States. And I just want to kind of revisit these basic principles again that I think apply to both domestic food safety regulation and imports, and the principles that I think really define what the government's role can be in food safety. And I think it's important to get clarity about that and relate that to what the private sector does. Because again, I just can't emphasize enough, despite kind of having mostly a government background on this subject, the government can't make the food safety. The people who produce and market it have to make it safe. What the government can do, and I think on behalf of society is expected to do, is define the standard of care, for the industry and for the industry's adoption of these preventive measures that we know scientifically are the right approach to preventing food safety problems. So the government has a role on behalf of society in setting that standard of care for preventive process control, having HACCP or HACCP-type systems in place. Second, and critically important, government should set the performance standards that provide objective measures of accountability for the results achieved through these preventive process control systems. It doesn't do enough to have a nice plan on paper that says we're going to have these controls in place if it's not clear what food safety outcome we're trying to achieve. And so by performance standard, I mean chemical residue levels such as the MRLs that Paul mentioned, but also microbial standards and standards for pathogen contamination, what's acceptable, what's not. The government has to set that standard of performance for preventive control systems and then be able to enforce them. And that's really the third principle. I mean, the government's role is to set standards and then inspect and enforce and to ensure that these standards are met, to be, on behalf of the public, the source of accountability. I want to emphasize that those principles apply both to domestic and imports because, in fact, if we're going to shift to this sort of approach, which people are beginning to talk about for imports, we're going to have to shift to that standard in the United States for domestic product as well because, again, we can't get away with having a dual system. Timing of this event is good. I think if those of you who've been watching food safety here may have noticed the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is the sort of the large umbrella organization representing the food industry in this country, issued a couple days ago what it calls its 4 pillars for consumer protection regarding imports. And if you take a look at that, I mean, I think it's a pretty important set of ideas. I personally think they're on the right track with this, and I think I say that because most of what's in there seems to resonate with what I've been saying. Not that they did it because I said it, but I think it just reveals that there's kind of a convergence of understanding of how we, can get where we want to go on food safety. So the industry's proposed approach to imports is adopts this principle of importer accountability across the board for imports, not just for seafood. It would also emphasize, I think wisely, harnessing the industry's capacity to manage their supply chains and the expertise that they've got. And so what they envision, at least as I understand their document, is that the government would sort of set a standard of care for preventive process control for imports, and it would be the industry's obligation to use their expertise and their systems to meet that standard of care. Interestingly, the proposal would also create an incentive for industry to go beyond that sort of base expectation, to adopt best practices. And the incentive would be a more expedited review at port of entry. So companies who can really go the next step in documenting, say through more elaborate product testing or other ways to demonstrate that they're going above and beyond, would have an incentive. In terms of more ease of access, entry into the United States. And then finally, importantly, the GMA proposals recognize that there is a need to strengthen FDA, and it's both authorities, legal authorities, and resources in order to make this sort of approach work. You also may have noticed that the President's Working Group on Import Safety issued a sort of an initial document a couple weeks ago outlining its sort of, I guess it's a framework, a conceptual framework for how it is thinking about proposing changes in import oversight. And again, the principles, at least as they're articulated in that document, I think are compatible with these, the ideas that GMA is putting out and that I think are emerging in the food safety community here, because they do speak to prevention. They do recognize the need for regulatory intervention and ability to control problems, and I think the concepts are excellent in that document. It's a much more general level of treatment of the subject than the GMA document, and I think there are a lot of details to fill in. And I think they've got a plan to do that in 60 days or so, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. So I would just finish by just emphasizing that. There is a direction that I think is emerging about where this all needs to go, but Congress has got to take hold of this issue and act on it. We're really talking about a complete transformation in the way FDA oversees imports. It's not something FDA can do on its own just by trying a little harder. I mean, they lack the mandate for prevention. I think that's the most fundamental thing. They've got a statute that is all about giving them some tools to react, but not mandating an approach to preventing foodborne illness. And they need the legal tools to back that mandate up, and they need the resources to do it. And it's really only Congress that can do that. The executive branch clearly has a role to play, needs to engage, but in the end, it's really up to Congress to fix this. So I'll close with that.
Thank you. I should note that this morning, unfortunately, Mike couldn't come, but this morning I actually dragged Drew and Paul up to the hill, and we had a small mini session of like this morning with them. And it does appear that there is a lot of interest up there on trying to figure out, and they were very keen, to hear about what's happening within China, but also what the EU is doing. So it's just, I mean, it's again, there is this. I like the idea of a convergence is happening, and what about China? We wonder if there's also a convergence happening there. And Drew is going to tell us, showing us pictures as well.
Am I driving this here? It looks like it. I see it.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest on the Hill in this issue, in the media and the public, and a lot of polling that proves that it's very major consideration for the U.S. public. It's also a major consideration for the Chinese public. I was asked specifically to speak to the challenges present in the Chinese food processing industry. So if this starts to sound decidedly negative, keep in mind I'm focusing on that wedge of the pie that causes the biggest challenge. As we've been discussing this, we tend to see a lot of these issues very much in black and white, particularly when it comes to China. And China is a place that's very large, very, in some ways, decentralized, and is in a state of almost constant and rapid change. So just as an example, the Chinese government has been very active visiting the United States and managing a fairly comprehensive publicity campaign to demonstrate that the vast majority of their food products are safe. 99% of their exports to Japan, the United States, EU, pass. They're not violative. Domestically, it's not quite as good, but still, looking at Chinese statistics, 85% of market basket of samples within a major supermarket will show you compliant products. So what we're going to kind of focus on is where's that 15% coming from. I'll do a quick overview of the bilateral food environment trade between the U.S. and China. I'll get into a couple of key challenges. Take a quick look at what they've been doing, because the Chinese have also been putting together reports and white papers and the like, and then give some sort of thought to what are some of the prospects and what might we be seeing going forward in the future. And it's not all bleak. Overall, U.S. and China have been engaged in pretty active food trade since good Chinese records were kept, starting in about 1980 when China joined the WTO. Their total exports to the United States, or globally that year, was $7.5 billion around the world. And you can see that by 2005, it had increased to about $53 billion. Total Chinese exports of all products and commodities in 1980 was 18%. In 2005, it was around 900 billion. So it gives you an indication that in 1980, food was a major export commodity for China. It was a major source of hard currency, and it comprised more than half of their total exports. By 2005, it's actually quite a small proportion. China's gained a lot of global market share primarily through low price, undercutting global consumers and taking applying their competitive advantage, low cost wage, and other activities we'll get into later. But bilaterally, U.S.-China trade is actually quite positive scenario for the United States. Traditionally, the U.S. has held a surplus in its trade with China. The U.S. is China's number one provider of agricultural products, imports. I've got some statistics here that the U.S. exported $6.7 billion and imported in exchange about $3.75 billion in 2006. I wouldn't get too hung up on the statistics. It's very, very complicated to track this, how things are classified, FOB prices, CIF prices. But by and large, we run a surplus, and it's something we really want to maintain in the future. Paul had a good chart showing the trends. And actually, I think last year they just about broke even, or maybe China exceeded the U.S. a bit, but that's expected to expand. And China's proportion of imports to the United States are not, they're not overwhelming, the overall imports. The bulk of U.S. imports come from Canada and Mexico, not from China. One statistic is in terms of processed food, not specifically, agricultural bulk products. China represents about 5% of the total imported processed food market in the United States. Some of the key items that we're talking about here, U.S. exports soybeans, hides, leather, cotton, poultry, wheat, and feed. And when we were on the Hill, of course, trade is a major, major issue, and the trade balance is part of that dialogue. And one of the interesting aspects is all of those shoes and handbags that we're importing here contributing to the deficit. It's U.S. leather. So understanding the trade balance is actually quite complicated, and food's a part of it. Major Chinese exports and prepared food, as I mentioned, and that can include frozen, processed, dried, even canned food products, but also fruits, vegetables, tea, pork, and garlic, which is actually an area where there's been a fair amount of trade tension over dumping. Aquaculture has also expanded quite rapidly in China. We call it the Blue Revolution. And it's gone from, I'll show you the statistics, 55 million in 2001 up to about 1.9 billion in 2006. And it makes up, about 23% of the seafood imports to the United States out of the total 70%. So it's a pretty significant portion. And also an area where there's been some particular challenges in terms of drug residues on the imported fish. I'm not, during this speech, going to get into any specific cases. They've been pretty well covered in the press, and if there's desire for more information, we can talk about it in the Q&A. So I'll highlight four what I would consider key challenges that China faces. Its agricultural system, and again, looking specifically at, should we say, the 15% challenge, as well as how China's economy is changing. Globalization is having a greater impact in China and how that's affecting us. Also, take a little look at the political structure and how it differs from ours. Not that it's a particular challenge, but some of the solutions that work for the Europeans, the Japanese, and the U.S. aren't necessarily going to be an easy plug-and-play option for the Chinese. I think the first thing to remember about China is, you do have a very broad range in quality, both amongst farms, but also amongst processors. And we mentioned, I was called out. I was the president of a fish company that took U.S. Alaskan wild salmon, shipped it to China, where a huge factory cut it up in little pieces, dried it into jerky, and we shipped it back here as snack food and also pet treats. It was very popular with kitty cats, little dried salmon pieces. We had a HACCP plan. I brought technical experts from the United States that had worked in the Alaskan fishing industry all of their life, and they show up at our Qingdao factory and said, "Oh my God, this is incredible. We got nothing like this in Alaska. It's purpose-built, brand new, heavily invested, lots of access to capital." We talk about all those loose bank loans that the Chinese banks keep giving out. That's where it's going. It's going into these beautiful tiled factories with built-in sanitizing stations, so the entire workforce is literally forced to sanitize themselves as they enter the facility and leave. I mean, it's hardwired for success. And in many cases, it's hardwired to achieve the Japanese standards, which makes the American market a little easier for them to enter because our standards are different. Processes are different, but the standards, I think, are, in a holistic way, somewhat lower. From the agriculture standpoint in China, the average Chinese farm is quite small. I think the average we were talking about earlier is about 2 acres. I think in some ways that's skewed. There are some very large farms in the north and northwest Mongolia where grazing is larger and some of the more commercial operations exist. But if you get into south and west China, Middle Eastern China, Huadong Dichu, it's very much very small postage stamp farms, less than an acre, and they're not even contiguous plots. So you've got farmers working very, very small, almost kitchen gardens. That poses all sorts of challenges when you're talking about disseminating information and technology to these very, very small processors that are spread throughout the country. In terms of the food processing, one particular challenge for the Chinese regulators is the bulk of these processors are small. 78%, according to Chinese statistics, are literally family-owned businesses, cottage industries. They've got less than 10 people. And the official, you might say, registered number of enterprises is about 450,000. But that said, prior to April of this year, there were all sorts of estimates within the Chinese media going up as high as 1 million food processing and distribution firms. So the question is, how many are actually out there? How many are registered? How do you keep track of anything in a country as large and populated as China? It's a huge challenge in whatever sector, whether it's the food processing environment, population. So there's a lot of sort of management issues that are not necessarily central to food processing, but are part of the entire overall governance issue. Chinese farms, as you know, there's very little available land. You can't do crop rotation very easily. You can't let a field lie fallow because you only have these two little small ones. So these farms have been intensively cultivated for generations, hundreds of years, literally. You get into the mountainous areas with these terraces. They were built in prehistory. Not that prehistory was that long ago, but these are family plots that have been handed down over generations, and then land reform sort of shifted them around in the 50s. But these fields, the soil is pretty much played out, so they have to really work to get decent production. And I don't have a chart, but if you look at Chinese food production, it's gone like this. So how are they squeezing out such regular increases in farming output? And also, you hear in the background that, wow, a lot of this farmland is disappearing and becoming cities, factories, riots here and there. So even as all of these little tiny plots are shrinking, they seem to be producing more and more. And a lot of that comes from high uses of fertilizer and other chemical inputs. And a lot of it also comes from better genetic seeds, genetic investments, and also animal husbandry as well. So there's a lot of technology that's gone into this, but that also poses a lot of problems, and we've been talking a bit about drug residues and fertilizer residues, and that's a byproduct of that. Also, in the rural areas, the distribution systems are terribly fragmented, and not just for the produce going out, but those inputs coming in. You have basically itinerant peddlers selling herbicides, insecticides and fertilizers and all the little inputs, fish feed for the fish farms. And the farmers don't always know, what the chemical makeup is. Is this compliant with Japanese standards, EU standards, HACCP? I mean, this is a guy that's, growing a bunch of fish, and he's just hoping they're going to live long enough for someone to come by and buy them. So you've got a very informal, cash-based economy in the rural areas that poses a pretty big challenge for tracking and tracing those imports. And the same way, when you've got the food ready for harvesting and being shipped out, you have a similar informal cash-based system for consolidating those products. Oops, am I going the wrong way? Yeah. Two other key elements are pretty important and relatively recent in sort of certainly the Chinese timeline. There's been massive investment in infrastructure, and the Chinese government, particularly the current leadership since they took over in 2002, has been very focused on reducing the urban-rural gap and trying to raise rural incomes. And they've had a number of policies, but mostly they're trying to encourage farmers to make money and to get rich and earn income. On the one side, they've canceled the Chinese agricultural tax, which has been in existence for 2,600 years. They canceled it in beginning of last year, 2006, and they've been phasing it out in different areas. So you've eliminated one source of income for the rural governments who are underfunded. Remember, it's not a federal government system, so there's not a lot of money coming from Beijing down to the local levels. It's very much a bottom-up revenue system. So these farmers are kind of getting a little more freedom from taxation, but they're also got other pressures from the government that has less formal revenue streams and has to sort of find other ways to tax and raise revenues. And some of that comes in, sort of illicit fees, fee for services, tax for fees, an old phrase they've been using. But largely what they want to do is they want to encourage small business and entrepreneurship, and that's very, very hard to regulate. There's also been massive investment in highways and telecommunication. And I think the expressway, just give a quick anecdote, well, maybe a statistic first. In 1988, China had exactly 100 kilometers of expressway. By 2006, they had 41,005. That's a huge change. And my anecdote was in 1994, I lived in Shanghai, and I wanted to get to Nanjing, couldn't get a train ticket. Picked up a taxi cab in the train station depot there and said, take me to Nanjing. I heard there's a highway. Said, yeah, I heard there's a highway too. Let's go. $100, pretty good deal. The highway wasn't finished. It only went to the border of Shanghai. And Shanghai's maybe 30 kilometers out of a 300-kilometer drive. So we flew right to the border where Jiangsu hit, and suddenly we're on what's known as a national road. And it's kind of the equivalent of a two-lane country road here in the States that sort of meanders through every single town, and literally goes right through each downtown area. It took me 9 hours. I think I was put out. You should have seen the cab driver, because he then had to go home. 1997, I got a lot of customers in Nanjing. I got to go see them. I hop in, at that time, a hired car. It took me 3 hours, 2 hours and 45 minutes to get to the outskirts of Nanjing because the highway was completed. So that has a lot of ramifications for getting all of those Chinese little manufacturers and produce farmers getting their products to market. And that's not necessarily intended to, first the Jiangsu farmer is going to get it to Nanjing, then it'll get on the truck to Shanghai, and then it'll get to Japan. They're really just trying to get to Nanjing or Shanghai in this case, right? They're trying to raise their income. They're not thinking globally. These are local farmers. But obviously it has an impact on us. And the other aspects are, penetration of cell phone technology in the Chinese countryside is immense. You can go almost anywhere in China except like a really, really steep valley somewhere next to a river and get cell phone reception. You can go God knows where, Tibet, and get cell phone reception. It's true. Part of it's military, part of it's civilian, but it's also a huge market. It's one of the few, China Inc. huge markets that you're going to see. China Mobile had a statistic that they put on about 2.6 million customers a month, and that's just China Mobile. I don't have the Unicom statistics in rural areas. So 2.6 million new cell phone subscribers to China Mobile in rural areas per month this year. So all those farmers suddenly know what's the cost for this corn or this wheat or this rice in the next town or the next place. So suddenly you're getting these networks of brokers and distributors and forming, but it's not yet regulated. It's not part of the old socialist planned economy. It's not part of the old production brigade system. Now those still exist. You still have these production production bases, which is kind of like the old socialist farm units that did production, and there is some elements that can be managed there, but by and large they're all on their own at this point. And technology is changing the way they engage with the rest of the country. And the other major input the other major connection to make is the internet. You can type into Alibaba.com, B2B website, and find dehydrated dehydrated anything out of China. And you can buy it from some guy in Shanghai who's got a briefcase and an internet connection, and he's got a connection somewhere in the countryside who's getting it from somewhere, which is how we got into trouble with pet food here. I bought it from somebody here, who bought it from somebody in L.A., who bought it from somebody in Shanghai, who got it from somebody in Nanjing, and it ended up in Suzhou, and it was a garage operation. So you get that sudden connection between that small producer who doesn't have any knowledge of international standards. He might be engaged in counterfeiting, which was that case. He was adulterating his products intentionally, suddenly having a very clear chain to the international markets. I'm sorry, I'm going to run over here if I keep telling stories.
But they do like stories.
Who doesn't like stories?
But we tell more in Q&A. Paul's got some real scary ones. So watch out when you ask him some questions.
I'll jump a little bit ahead. But as I mentioned, where that greatest challenge is also where the government capacity is very weak. And I kind of mentioned ahead, there's a conflict of interest there between cracking down and shutting down a manufacturer who maybe isn't meeting standards, and keeping him in business so he can continue to be taxed and raise his income and satisfy the other big requirements coming out of Beijing, which is lift the economy. The U.S. food safety system. I mean, the theme that you heard here is the government doesn't do everything here. It's a public-private partnership. Industry has a very, very strong role here. The Grocery Manufacturers Association put out their white paper, consumers, safety, and public-private partnership in imports. And it's really pointing out that the importers are responsible, and they have a responsibility to the consumer. They're part of a legal system. They've got insurance coverage. They're tapped into fairly developed distribution markets here. But it's very much kind of a partnership between the regulators who set out regulations and then the industry that kind of also helps shape. There's a great deal of back and forth between industry and regulation here. China doesn't really have that. China doesn't have civil society. I mean, that's one of the key themes in Jennifer's program. You know, civil society is underdeveloped in China, and one of the impacts from that is you don't have strong associations representing the manufacturers. We also know that in China, the legal system is not independent of the government. So they have to make careful choices when they punish a local factory that might be putting out a dangerous good, because they've got to consider local ownership. They both answer to the same boss. They also have to consider social stability and the employment situation. So the consumer safety laws here in the U.S. very much put the onus on the manufacturer to protect the consumer, whereas in China it's a much more holistic approach towards harmony, right? China's going to make its own system. I'm not criticizing China for not having free media and not doing, I know there's plenty of folks in the media, and I think by and large the coverage of some of these incidents has been pretty good and balanced and measured and well done. It's never going to play in China that way. They really want to control it differently. They kind of take out the disincentive for the company to really build in those controls or overbuild those controls. We talk about voluntary systems. I mean, that's overbuilding your plan to ensure safety because you don't want to get called out in the media. You don't want to be on the front page of the New York Times for that. You don't want to be sitting in front of a panel of senators answering questions about where the lead came from. Mm-hmm. So the Chinese system is going to have to develop something that's going to be very different from ours. It's going to be difficult for them to find answers from our system. But China's been doing a lot. I think they've been telling us they're taking this very seriously, and they are. Wu Yi is on TV. Wen Jiabao is on TV. They're making plans. They had in July, middle of July, both the U.S. and China had the exact same reaction to this problem. We need an intergovernmental committee to deal with this because this is not just sort of the health sector, the FDAs. I mean, you got to get a bunch. You need the commerce people, the industry people, So they got all their committees together, 19 in total, put it under Wu Yi, magical Vice Premier Wu Yi, who can fix almost anything. She took care of SARS. Can she take care of this? She's not so good on IPR issues and counterfeiting, which is linked to this. Again, the local government's protecting the counterfeiters. How do you get over that hump? So you've got the coordinating committee. There's a within the 5-year plan, the great 5-year plan that the NDRC determines, how everything gets funded. There's a food and drug safety component embedded in that. So there is actually going to be funding allocated out over the next 5 years to help build up this system. So there is lab capacity. So there is increased inspection capacity. China put out a white paper they've been showing around that really details in a lot of detail what they're doing and what laws they've been updating and the regulatory system. But this is a very top-down approach. I read through it and found the word consumer in it once, compared to the GMA's proposal, which is the title is about the consumer. So it's a completely different approach. I'm not criticizing one or the other. It's just these are very, very fundamentally different systems. Top-down primarily in China, bottom-up primarily in the U.S. Now, we are going to end on a good note. We promise that. It's not all bad. There's potential here. Even though you've got, low capacity in rural areas to implement some of these things, there are elements of coordination, and there are some bright spots in the countryside. There are farmers' associations. There is an ag extension system. There is a veterinary corps as a part of the Ministry of Agriculture that go out and do animal husbandry work. There's actually an animal husbandry bureau in almost every single county that helps ensure genetic diversity and vaccination distribution amongst local stocks. But again, the challenge is, this is a nice guy taking his rice crop from out back. It's not the same guy, but it's the same area. He's making rice here, and then he's turning it into rice noodles here. Is he licensed? And actually, you can kind of see the inside of the shop in one of those pictures, and the answer is, I don't see a license hanging there. What are you going to do? You're going to close him down? Excuse me, sir, may I see your HACCP plan? He's been doing it this way since his father, his grandfather. I mean, this is handed down ancient technology. It's kind of like Chinese medicine. How do you regulate that here? And the answer is we can't regulate Chinese medicine here. It's a different sort of holistic system based on faith that this is not doing any harm. I described a little bit decentralized production system. You go to rural areas and every family's got 3 pigs and 5 chickens. How are you going to register? How are you going to register that? How are you going to manage that? How are you going to ensure what they're being? We joke, never mind what you feed pigs. I mean, that's too awful to look at. But what drugs are they getting, right? And again, some guy came and said, "Oh, your pig's sick with this. Here's a vaccine. Everyone's using it. Does it work? Yeah, it works. What's in it? I don't know." A lot of these guys aren't even literate. I mean, literacy rates are quite low. And, technical language, hard. I mean, I've been studying Chinese for years. Technical stuff is hard. I got dictionaries this thick. They don't. So how do you disseminate that technology here? I mean, here's a guy, you can't really see it, but he's got a pig bundled up in the back of his cart and he's taking it to market. Why is the pig in the last thing you want is your pig to walk to market because he might lose weight. And they're sold by weight there. So no, these guys are real practical and they're not dumb. They're just not educated. They don't have access to information. It also leads to some bad behaviors. In the case of many pig processors, 2 days before market day, they take a rag and shove it up the bum and keep feeding the pig. It adds a couple kilos, and that's what matters at the end of the day. So you've got this poor constipated pig in the back of the cart coming from God knows where, going to a market that's been going on for since Ming Dynasty every other Wednesday. What is the food inspector to do? Pull a guy over and say, "License and registration, please." Proof of insurance. A HACCP plan in the United States is intricately linked to your insurance coverage. $1 million product liability coverage. No major store is going to take your product in the United States unless you've got liability coverage that covers you and them. Right? It's not just slip and fall. It's getting sick. As a small producer, and I'm not a small producer. I was a long time ago. That's what you're afraid of. You're afraid of getting sued. Right? That's where the punishment's going to come. So you've got the insurance company, the legal system. How did I get a HACCP plan? I mean, I'm not a food safety expert. I'm a China expert. I went to what was then the NFPA, the GMA. They had technical experts. I had a strategic partner, the guy I brought from Alaska to go, "Wow, look at the plant," and said, "Here's what we need to do here to fix up the edges. Here's your plan." Insurance company looked at it, approved it. FDA took it, made sure it went through the NFPA, gave it its blessing. It's a good system. None of that exists in China, so it's going to have to change, or it's going to have to adapt. I'm finishing up. I'm running late.
The whip is coming out.
There's a great deal of bilateral discussions going on at the moment. There's a pretty major high-level team from the U.S. HHS, FDA, who are there in China this week, meeting with their counterparts. Their counterparts from Beijing were here last week. This is an ongoing set of dialogues. And it's an area the Chinese really want to fix. It's an area where we have a shared core interest in getting this right. So in that respect, I think the trends are pretty good, and I think they really want to work with us. They want to absorb technology. They want to look for answers. It's not going to be an easy marriage, but they're open to getting our help and to keeping our markets open, and that'll help ensure that their markets stay open to us, which takes it back to the beginning of my presentation. We want to maintain a positive trade relationship with the Chinese. Thank you for letting me run a little long.
That's okay. Thank you very much. And if I could ask Mayu and Ma Tianjie and Mayu, I've got two Ma starting back there. They're on the mics, and raise your hand. And when you do ask a question, if I could trouble you to say your name and affiliation. We did a little changing chairs out here, and there are anecdotes, and that these folks will be able to also share with you. I don't think any will top the pig one, but but please, some questions, comments. Raise your hand high so I can point you out to my microphone managers. Right over here, Mayu. This gentleman right here with the glasses.
Scott Harold from Brookings Institution. This is for Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson, you have painted a fairly cooperative image of the Chinese. Obviously, they have a major incentive to cooperate with the U.S. to maintain access to our markets. Recently, however, there was a report in the media. I don't remember what outlet it was, but it was describing how the Indonesians and Southeast Asians had not been receiving equal levels of positive treatment from their Chinese counterparts. And in fact, the story that sticks with me was the Indonesian Minister for Food and Health Safety saying, the Chinese visited my office, and instead of saying, we'll do anything we can to comply, we appreciate your laws, they said, why don't you go ahead and lower your laws? Why don't you meet our standards inside of China rather than us meeting your standards? I'm wondering, is this an issue where you see compliance with the U.S. only, or compliance with the major powers, EU, Japan, but smaller powers being pushed around, or was that an anomalous story? Or can you give us a broader outlook?
Okay. And I think Paul will probably be able to jump in on that too. Yeah.
Thank you.
The Vice Minister of Quality Control was here in D.C. last week, and he had a number of events. He met with everybody from Secretary Paulson, USDA, FDA. There was a very open food consumer product safety summit on September 11th held over at the Commerce Bureau to talk about specifically toys and fireworks, cigarette lighters. The response from the Chinese was actually quite interesting. They spent a great deal of time trying to demonstrate that there are Chinese standards, and then there's this much fuzzier sort of U.S. regulatory structure that's based on sort of voluntary compliance, which is a very difficult concept to explain. I mean, you voluntarily pay your taxes because the alternative is they're going to come banging on your door. But how do you know what you're supposed to do if it's not laid out? And basically, they, I think to very summarize it, is they said the U.S. is that your regulations don't necessarily comply with ours, and as part of the business contract, you didn't stipulate it in your contracts. So the producer produced what they were supposed to produce. So whose fault is that? It's the importer's fault. And by U.S. law, the importer is the liable one. So the importer has an obligation, and that was very much the Chinese message, is that the importer has the obligation to make sure that the product they buy matches their own import laws. Now it's a question, how do you shape that? Did Vice Minister Wei come and bully the CPSC to change the U.S. lead laws? No, he didn't. But if you're in a different position, you could interpret it as a rather aggressive stance. And again, the Chinese don't feel that they've gotten a very fair shake out of this whole deal. You look at the toy importation. I know we're here on food, but the toy importation issue, 18 million Mattel toys were recalled, but most of that was over a design problem, and we didn't design the toy. We built it to spec. So they're not feeling that they're getting a terribly fair shake out of our regulatory processes here. Certainly not from our media. They don't understand why we can't control our media better. Yeah, and you know, it's fun to watch the USG guys sort of receive that one. I'm like, how do we wish, teach us something here, because media beats us up all the time. But I mean, that's the joy of the system, but that's not the way their system works. So, I mean, I can't comment on, what happened in Indonesia. I think the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs denied that that's the way it actually played out. But part of the theme that we're talking about, and Paul covered it a lot, there's no uniformity of standards here. I mean, Codex Alimentarius is really a goal. So what they're pointing out is you've got goals, we've got goals, you have a scientific basis for your belief, we have a scientific basis for our belief. How do we harmonize the two? So I think that's kind of what they're really trying to get across. They can't give in sovereignty, right? They can't give in and say, hey, we'll just accept yours, your standards. Boom, no problem. They can't do that. They've got to say, hey, here's our standards, here's yours. Where's the middle ground? Let's form an MOU to discuss it. Let's come up with new standards that are acceptable to both of us. Bullying? We're dependent on them. They're dependent on us for trade.
Paul, do you have some comments to add to that?
I do, actually. I would pretty much agree with that. I'm the youngest of four boys in my family, so I got used to being Thunderbirds 4 in all of the games, the little yellow one that you never seen on television. And my mother used to take me aside and say, do you know what, Paul, if you don't ask, you won't get. You've got to push yourself forward. And what I tried to highlight in my talk there today was that unless you have firm legislation, unless you have a legal basis for taking action, you will not get the desired results. you need to have a legal basis and you need to enact it, and that's really the bottom line. It's up to Indonesia to enforce that.
Okay. Some other questions or comments out here? Raise your hand high so I can see you. Right here up in front. Ma Tianjie, can you pass it up here? I'd come around the middle. Well, either way.
Thank you. I'm Tada Atsumori, Embassy of Japan. This is a question for Mr. Taylor. You referred to the necessity for FDA to be given more mandate for prevention and as well as legal tools. Could you explain a little bit more what kind of mandate and legal tools are possible for FDA?
Yeah. Well, one example of a way that FDA could have a mandate for prevention in the import situation is to authorize FDA to establish a requirement that product offered for import be produced under a system, a documented system of controls that are adequate to assure the safety of the product, so that there's some assurance that safety has been built into the product. You've got a basis for knowing that it's safe when it arrives at the port of entry, and so you're not dependent solely on testing at the port of entry. So it's that basic principle of the processor, producer taking responsibility and having a system for ensuring safety. And FDA has no mandate to impose that on imported products right now, and would need Congress to act to give it that authority. And then the enforcement tools to enforce that requirement, so that it could exclude product if that demonstration of the product was produced under those preventive controls was not satisfactory at the port of entry. I think FDA also needs authority to condition import on access to foreign plants, so it can conduct inspections without depending on the permission, the optional granting of permission by the foreign country or the plant. So it's that sort of thing, just to really strengthen the authorities to be preventive.
Okay, good. And Judith Shapiro has a question.
What a great panel. There is a kind of a gap in the presentation, though, because we think of the EU and Japan as being models to some degree as far as their awareness of food safety issues, and we didn't get a similar sense of how high the food safety issue is on the American consumers' agenda. I think intuitively we know it's much lower. And none of you talked about labeling of country origin as one way to perhaps raise the American consumers' awareness of where the food is actually coming from. So that's one thing I'm wondering if somebody could comment on. And the other thing is, perhaps for Drew Thompson, you mentioned that food safety is a common concern for the U.S. and China, but you didn't talk about how the Chinese middle class is feeling very uncertain about their safety of their own food, and what avenues are available to the Chinese middle class right now to exert some pressure.
Plethora of good questions. Do you want to start off?
I'll start off. I doubt that if you took a poll in the U.S., you'd get exactly the same results you got in Japan, where for 70% of consumers, safety is the first consideration. I think, there's a pretty strong assumption among consumers in this country that food is safe if it's out there in the marketplace. So I think you get a different number from a polling standpoint. On the other hand, the reason, for example, that the United Fresh Produce Association called for mandatory enforceable standards and criteria for the safe growing of produce is because they are concerned that their market, the confidence of consumers in their products, is in jeopardy. It's the same reason why the grocery manufacturers are recommending some very strong transformative measures for imports. So I think it is on the consumer agenda, and I think that's the best evidence of that is the way in which the companies whose job it is to meet consumer expectations are changing their position on public policy. This issue of country of origin labeling, there are a lot of reasons why people might want to know the origin, country of origin. I personally am one that just generally thinks the more information the better. I don't, have a strong position either way on country of origin labeling, except to say, don't think country of origin labeling is a safety system. I mean, so what if you have country of origin labeling? What does that tell you about the conditions under which that product was produced? I mean, we need a system that ensures safety without people having to guess based on the country of origin labeling. So again, I think it's a perfectly legitimate issue, and there's a lot of reasons to consider it attractive. But I don't think we ought to think of that as the way we ensure safety.
Just to follow on the point about on whether how high on the agenda food safety is. If this was a scientific conference, I would tell you that Japanese information, the data that I presented, was representative, and all the scientists in the room would know that I picked the very best one that I could that illustrated my point. In similar kind of surveys that have been carried out across a number of different countries, maybe not as extensive surveys, but the data is very similar. Food safety is always top of the agenda, and typically in other countries, even countries like Brazil, for example, food safety was seen by about 50% of people as being the number one item of concern.
Okay. The Chinese middle class.
Middle class. That's a wonderful topic because it's not just a food safety issue. It's every issue. It's ownership rights. It's could be a driver of a great number of things, and hopefully this would be one of them. Obviously, the growth of civil society in China is slow. It's not necessarily meeting everyone's expectations, and the middle class is a potentially big driver of that. What you have seen in China is the growth of supermarkets in the urban areas. And 1990, when I was a little undergraduate student running around in Beijing University, I had to go to wet markets every morning to go, give me that piece of whatever, and they'd cut it off and carry it home in your little, bicycle rack. 5 years later, you start to get some supermarkets coming up, and some of the folks are kind of, I like to get it fresh, and I like to watch them kill the chicken right there in front of me. But it didn't take long for people to say, hey, I kind of like it in, Saran wrap, and the price is on it, so I don't get ripped off, because my accent doesn't match the market here. So I mean, the middle class, kind of has been driving a much more regulated and manageable food safety, framework through the supermarket system and the purveyors, and that goes from Metro and Carrefour and Walmart now, and some of the more recent entrants. But there's a lot of domestic Chinese supermarkets that have sprung up largely to serve the urban middle class. You don't have that yet in the rural sector, so you kind of have that old China versus the new China. You've also seen the growth of green food, right? Some more environmentally, it's not quite organic. They have an organic stand, and there's a lot of debate over whether or not it's for real or whether the standards are consistent. But again, pick an issue in China, and you have the same debate about how consistently something is enforced. So that's another element that's starting to teach the producers that there's a premium being placed on quality by a certain sector of the market. So it's there, but again, it's a proportion of the market. It doesn't represent the whole, and that leads to the potentially very dangerous situation. And I mean dangerous, perhaps, to the senior leadership of a two-tiered quality system forming, where you kind of have the cheap, shoddy, fly-by-night, fake products sold to the rural and the urban poor, and then a much higher standard, almost export level quality domestic products. That's an issue that the Chinese government, I don't think, is terribly comfortable with. The leadership doesn't want to say, well, we save our best stuff for Japan, and feed you the leftovers. That's not a politically very appealing message to this leadership. They focus on what's called the people first policy. They really want to ensure domestic stability, social harmony, right? And that means securing your food supply.
Should note, I know that I've heard that there's actually a really big chain now in Shanghai. It's called O Supermarket. It's all organic, evidently, and that, again, it is a growing market. And I've heard, I haven't found him yet. Someone told me there is a consumer safety Ralph Nader in China. Does anyone know him?
Yeah, no, he's
okay,
been
we'll
interviewed.
Talk
He's out there.
Okay, I need to.
He's not running for president.
But no, but it's true that in terms of like the civil society sector, I mean, we see in the environmental side that has been the largest, but food safety, I think it's still kind of more the GONGO, the government organized NGO type organizations there. Okay, I had a question right here. Wait for Mayu to come toss the mic at you.
I'm Jeff Gren from the U.S. Department of Commerce. First of all, it was a great panel. I thought it was a good coverage. Mm-hmm. One of the fears that I see in all this, a global situation of food safety is a possible backlash of over-regulation, especially where isn't a global system, and I see places like China is where we would see the most risk of that. You know, places like AQSIQ and SFDA establishing all sorts of regulatory and registration requirements and testing and things that we've seen in other regulated industries such as pharmaceuticals and medical devices. And I'd like to get the panel's reaction.
Okay. Okay, you guys, react. React.
I completely agree with you. That's something that I have been predicting for a number of years. Since I first started going to China, when I first went back in 2003 or maybe early 2004, I think that might have been their food safety year. And there really wasn't very much interest or very much focus on food safety there. And I went back only maybe 9 months later, actually with Waters to help some of the people there set up some of these methods. And I was quite astounded at how far they'd moved in only 9 months. And at that point, I came back and I started speaking to the people in my organization and saying, you know, it's exactly that. This could become a double-edged sword. We're enforcing our regulations onto them. These people are building the capacity. And, you know, we're also relying on China as an export market for us, and they have the capacity now to turn that back on us and say, well, you know, we reject your product. And it has happened. They've recently rejected U.S. product because of ractopamine being present in pork and so on. So, yes, absolutely. And it probably makes it all the more reason why the Codex Alimentarius goal of harmonization of standards should become all the more important.
Anyone else want to react to it? Or?
You know, I guess my perspective on that, looking at the U.S. situation, is that we're so bogged down in checks and balances, the chances that, I mean, even though we do tend to legislate in reaction to crisis, you know, our system results in negotiated outcomes basically legislatively. And I think there's an opportunity for that here that'll get the right preventive measures in place, but still a system that, you know, is grounded in the industry doing its job and the government having an appropriate accountability function. I hope that's the outcome.
But before another question, I want to interject something, because I know when we were up on the Hill in talking about one of the queries was about, you know, again, China's way forward. And Paul, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Thailand, about what happened there, because I think that, you know, again, trying to force China to regulate the way we do, or the EU or Japan, is not necessarily realistic in terms of like the political system, as Drew noted, but, you know, there are positive signs. So could you tell us just a minute about what happened in Thailand? And
when we were discussing this morning at this morning's meeting, I think we all became aware that it was starting to sound very, very negative, and that, you know, it sounded like we were down on China, and China was never going to be able to fix these problems because we were highlighting all of the deficiencies and all of the difficulties that they were facing. But in real terms, it has happened. It has happened in other places, and the best example probably is Thailand. In Thailand, back in 2002, they had huge problems, and I showed you the slide there where their aquaculture and their poultry, their two biggest exports, were essentially shut down because every consignment was being held at the border inspection ports at the first point of entry into the EU and it was being tested. And typically it was taking them around a month before they were getting the test results, so the consignments were sitting there for a long time. It was a major problem for Thailand. And the government there and the industry and the technology leaders like Waters Corporation, we all got together and helped to formulate plans and took that forward. They had a lot of things to address, and a lot of the things are exactly the same things that China faces. They had this very small, fragmented, very dispersed production system where there were very small production units, and the product was being pulled together with no traceability. There wasn't a very effective testing procedure put in place. And basically everyone had to work together. It involved, like I said, the government, but also the producers and also people like us in Waters to go in there and help them to formulate policies, develop the testing programs. The EU got involved also to help them to develop their traceability studies. And really they turned the whole thing around within just a few years. And now within that region, the ASEAN region, Thailand really are held up as an example of how this can work. And I personally don't see any reason why China can't do the same thing, albeit on a very much bigger scale.
Yeah, but as you know, as Drew pointed out, I mean, at the top level, you know, there is the incentive. So you know, again, just pointing to somewhat encouraging potential trends.
Yeah, in China, the big challenge is always scale up, whatever your issue is, and you know, diffusion of technology. I mean, again, the public-private partnership tends to limit the lack of a private sector leading role in this can actually hinder China's uptake of this technology. But I think the Thailand example is a good one, and I mean that's a neat project to consider. You know, take the USG, take a private sector, show them the public-private partnership, bring in the Thai regulators, because you're really talking about exporting country, importing country, private sector. Take that model and pilot it in China, and then if it takes, like any good pilot, everything in China starts with a pilot. Hell, capitalism started, you know, in Shenzhen and then spread out. They got to pilot it first. Take a model like that, demonstrate it, pilot it. You know, start it in Jiangsu or Hubei, a country, an area which has good aquaculture, whichever your test is, and then when it works, they'll hold it up as a model, and pretty soon it'll spread everywhere, and it'll spread, you know, beyond your control. I mean, you can't hang on to your intellectual property in China easily, because if it's a good idea, it cascades very quickly. So it's not all bleak. I mean, if you get a good workable idea, it can scale up fast on its own.
Okay, first, right there, that gentleman, and then you'll be next. Sorry, he was in the dark waving. Yes, and he has the mic, so I can't really control it anymore.
All right. Yeah, Steve Clapp with Food Chemical News and Food Traceability Report. Mention of China and Codex in the same breath reminded me that China has now taken over the leadership of the Codex Committee on Food Additives and the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues, which were formerly held by the Netherlands. And a number of other Asian countries are also leading Codex committees now, a task force on antibiotic resistance and biotech foods, Japan. So can we view this as an encouraging trend?
Yeah.
I'll start.
You can start, yeah.
Yeah, I think we absolutely can view this as an encouraging trend, and actually it's not really that much of a surprise to me, because China in some ways has been forced to focus a lot of attention on these, particularly for the Japanese market. I mean, it's something that things have changed very dramatically in China in terms of food safety testing for export since May 2006, when the Japanese regulations came into place. I've been to China a couple of times since then, and really all of the talk has been focused on, particularly on pesticides, because the Japanese legislation was focused largely on pesticides. And there's been a lot of attention there, and a lot of laboratories are gearing up specifically to address Japanese legislation. And I was there just a couple of months ago, and now they feel that they've kind of cracked the pesticide issue, and they're moving on. They're looking at veterinary drug residues. So it's just no surprise to me whatsoever that they're starting to take control of some of these groups within Codex.
Okay. And you right here?
Thank you. Actually, my question follows quite nicely on that.
Can you say your name? Sorry.
I'm Kathleen Barnes. I'm with EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs.
Appropriately enough. That's why I wanted to make sure they knew who you were.
We've just begun in the last few years working with developing our relationships with China and trying to get a bilateral program in place. And we have, of course, for years worked with them in a multilateral basis, and they are very savvy and sophisticated. I would agree with you that it's no surprise that they took over these Codex committees. But what I'm thinking about is the farmer that has half an acre and the distribution system of pesticides within China. I wonder if someone could comment on that, how our products distribute it. How does the little farmer learn about the global Codex Alimentarius standards for pesticide residues?
Can I start on that, and then maybe you can address it? There's a couple of issues that raises, and the first one that immediately springs to mind for me is I was at a conference there in China in April, and there was someone speaking at that conference, and they said one of the biggest issues that they currently see with pesticide residues in China is the fact, they quoted it as a fact now, but I wasn't given a source, but the fact that 40% of all of the pesticides that are being sold in China are counterfeit. And that's a huge difficulty, because that means that no one really knows what's actually in those products. So that's number one. They've got to deal with that. If we say that there are 100 pesticides licensed for use, but 40% of the ones that are on the market are actually counterfeit, they may contain another 300 that weren't intentional, weren't intended to be there. So that's probably a big issue, and that's the first thing that's got to be addressed. Is making sure that the farmers are educated to know that when they use these unlicensed products, that they may not be using the compounds that they think they're putting on.
But sometimes I've also heard when someone wrote an article for me a few years on this, they said that farmers know that they do know that a lot are fake, and so they just apply a lot more of every pesticide. More better, I mean, but again, the farmers are not stupid. Never accuse, they're very intelligent. But again, they're operating the fact that this stuff could be fake, and they really want to, grow their food.
Can I tell a story?
Oh yes,
A short one.
Can you tell a story?
A short
guys?
one.
Yeah, okay.
It's Paul is absolutely right, and I think the 40% statistic that you heard in a conference in Beijing by a Ministry of Agriculture official, like any statistic in China, take it with a grain of salt. I think it's probably much worse. Suicide in China is largely more women commit suicide in China than men, which is the opposite of here. And the leading method for rural women to commit suicide is drinking of pesticides. Mm-hmm. There was a letter posted in a rural Chinese newspaper a couple of years ago that happened to come across my desk. It was a letter thanking the pesticide company for making such a shoddy product because she drank a gallon and lived. And it was a social commentary issue, and it made the rounds. This was before the days of bulletin boards, but it illustrates the point. I think Paul is completely correct. And you've got snake oil salesmen. I mean, again, we can do a marketing survey and find out, where, each farmer. And if you go to any place in China, it'll be different. If you go to the plains around Jiangsu, where you've got larger plots, better access to distribution systems, you'll have a much more regulated market for fertilizer supply. But if you go to the mountains of Guizhou or southern Sichuan or Gansu or some of these poorer areas, it's peddlers. It's a secondary, tertiary market. And the entire distribution system, I don't care if you're doing food, pharmaceuticals, whatever your industry, there are no national distributors. I mean, I get up, come to work in the morning, and before dawn, and there's the big McLean truck unloading the products at the delis all over town. There's only a couple of major purveyors of products here. It's a pretty manageable system. But in China, every province has its own state-owned distributor. Then there's all the little private distributors that kind of circle around. There's no national distribution. There's not even regional distribution to speak of. It's very, very fragmented, even at the more formal, more professional level. And then how do those companies get market penetration? And again, rural is almost by definition total penetration to the land. So a lot of that's depending on secondary, tertiary vendors, and they're not much more than snake oil salesmen. So good luck.
Well, no, I mean, but it comes back, and I'm sure you'll be very familiar with this as well. But what the problem that it raises is that we do not know what we're looking for. There are maybe these 100 compounds that we know are licensed for use, but there could be 300 or 400 or 500 more that are actually being used in reality. And that's the challenge. The challenge is that we have to develop methods that are capable of screening for very, very large numbers of the compounds, whether they're licensed for use or not. And that's, you may ask, well, why is there someone from Waters even sitting on this panel? And that's why because we're very focused on this. And we're there trying to develop the methods, trying to implement those methods to be able to screen for vast numbers of chemicals with every single analytical run, to make the people on the ground in China, but also here in the US, to make the people on the ground that much more effective in controlling these problems.
Okay. And right next to Kathleen, microphone. And I think this will be our last question. So
Betty Heilman from Chemical and Engineering News. I was wondering, this is sort of off the subject in a way, but because China doesn't export very much pork, but are they making progress against the pig virus, and how can they make progress with so many very small farmers?
I think actually China's the 4th largest pork exporter in the world. So everything, again, China, superlative everything. So little did you know. Okay, but to answer your question about the disease, the blue ear disease.
The blue ear disease, reproductive porcine syndrome. There's very poor transparency. The Ministry of Agriculture in China is a very conservative organization, very concerned with secrecy. And that goes back to their corporate culture, if you will, their organizational culture back to Soviet days. So they're not really comfortable releasing information. I think it's really impossible to tell, and I don't think that's directed at us either. I think if you follow Chinese statistical reporting, they have a tough time. I mean, Wen Jiabao has a tough time getting these statistics because the reporting system is bottom up, and it's the source of a great deal of humor in Chinese society. How the county official or the village reports to the township to the county to the prefecture. Everyone adds a little something or deducts a little something based on what the target is to the number. So by the time it gets to Beijing, it can be wildly inaccurate. And just as the example, every year at the National People's Congress, all 31 provinces report above average economic growth. Yeah, figure that one out, huh? Well, and then they have a sort of a little mark off and say, oh, there's no way Tibet did that and did this, and we know what the inputs were, and then they sort of handicap. But it's tough for them. It's their own system. It's not targeting us. It's a transparency system within their own system that it's not adequate.
Well, good. Well, on that question, I just want to note that we are actually planning to have, we are trying to gather experts on CAFOs in China, the factory farms there. So we can maybe answer the pork questions in greater detail once we can dig up those experts. I want to say that this is excellent panel. I mean, this is a great kickoff for this beginning of our food safety meetings, which I horribly embarrassingly I didn't acknowledge that Waters Corporation is actually supporting the China Environment Forum to do this kind of work, and that we will be doing. My assistant Lynn and I will be doing research over the next few months, probably tracking down some of the people in this room, again to get more information about how, not only what's going on in China, but what's happening in the U.S. and how to use this as a way to promote cooperation. It merits mention that the U.S., the strategic economic dialogue that the U.S. government is having with China, again, it's led by Treasury. It's not just about economics. It has an environmental component, energy, and they also have a food safety task force as well. So again, this has become high level on both sides, and again, SED is really